The agreement as it stands is completely unacceptable. Russia won't accept it. However, Russia is going to approach this in a very Russian way, which is they're going to welcome the opportunity to negotiate and continue talks with Washington. And I think the language from Lavrov will be something along the lines of, in hopes of achieving a just solution that will serve the interests of both countries. Very diplomatic language. But if you got Sergei aside, drinking a beer, he'd say, this is a non-starter. The West is still not listening to us. Now that said, when you go through the 28 different points, it shows at least somebody on the US side actually put thought into it. This was not a casual or cavalier effort. There was some understanding of what some of the issues are, and so it's a start. It's a good starting point. In simple terms, Russia is being polite, not persuaded. They'll sit at the table and use diplomatic language, but behind closed doors they see this agreement as a non-starter. The real issue is the same one we've seen for years. Washington talks, but it doesn't listen. Yes, the 28-point proposal shows someone in the US finally put real thought into this, but until the West accepts Russia's security concerns as they see them, not as we wish they were, negotiations will stay stuck in the same loop. When you go through the document, it is clearly written from a US perspective, not taking into account what Putin, the foreign ministry, the military, and other political leaders have said for quite some time. Russia has interests. Putin laid those out very clearly on June 14, 2024. And if nothing else, those interests have not changed. In fact, Russia is now in a position that if those interests are not satisfied, they will expand them. They're going to take Dnipro, they're going to take Kharkiv, they'll take Sumy, probably Poltava, and then they'll give the people in those regions the chance to vote on whether or not they want to join the Russian Republic. In simple terms, Washington keeps writing proposals from its own worldview while ignoring what Moscow has been saying openly for years. Putin laid out Russia's red lines in 2024, and none of them have changed. They've hardened. And when a great power feels unheard, it doesn't compromise, it expands. That's why he's warning about places like Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Sumy. It's not bluff, it's leverage. If Russia's security interests aren't respected, they'll redraw the map themselves. One of the craziest things in this document is item number 6, which says the size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. When the special military operation started, the total size of the Ukrainian military was estimated at 260 to 280,000 active duty. They probably had another 600 to 700,000 reservists, but active duty was under 300,000. When Russia and Ukraine met in Istanbul in March 2022, Russia said the peacetime cap for active duty Ukrainian forces should be 85,000. So here's the US saying 600,000, almost 8 times what Russia was willing to live with in 2022. They're not going to agree to that. That's a perfect example of Western delusional thinking. However, it's a point to be discussed, and Russia will return to the table and say why 600,000 is unacceptable and why 85,000 is what they could live with. That's negotiations. This may actually have been the intent, to create a US proposal that looks reasonable on the surface but is guaranteed to be rejected by Ukraine. Then Washington can turn around and say, we tried everything. The Ukrainians prevented the agreement. We're done. And that aligns with what many sources in Moscow keep saying. This war will end once the US pulls out, once the CIA operations, intelligence sharing, and weapons support stop. Ukraine can't sustain the fight without the American lifeline. The numbers tell the story. Russian officials say Ukrainian casualties, killed and wounded, are around 40,000 per month, and it's been that way through all of 2025. That's nearly 500,000 in 2025 alone. Even pro-Ukrainian think tanks estimate 20 to 40,000 desertions per month. That's 60 to 80,000 losses monthly. Meanwhile, new recruits are maybe 25,000 per month, and they're barely trained. They're handed uniforms, handed guns, and shoved straight to the front. The math is brutal. Ukraine is losing far more people than it can replace. Russia has said repeatedly it wants a normal relationship with Washington. Normal as in Cold War normalcy. Diplomats in capitals, direct flights, constant communication channels even during crises. That existed even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today it doesn't. A few simple steps from Washington could restore normalcy quickly. Reopen direct flights, return Russian diplomatic property Obama seized, lift the ridiculous 25-mile travel restriction on Russian diplomats. But none of this has been done, and Russia is frustrated. They hear the words, but they don't see action. The problem for Trump is that the moment he tries to normalize relations, establishment forces in both parties will accuse him of treason, surrendering to Russia, not being tough enough, and so on. The neoconservative establishment in D.C. is entrenched in think tanks, media, and the defense industry. They will not allow normalized relations with Russia because too much money is being made from conflict. If you remove Russia as the big enemy, how do you justify a $1 trillion defense budget? And that so-called $100 million corruption scandal is nothing. The real number stolen from U.S. taxpayers is over $48 billion. Some of it going into the pockets of prominent Republicans and Democrats. With names that powerful involved, no investigation is going anywhere. This is the core issue. Peace doesn't pay. Conflict does. And the U.S. has no financial incentive to seek peace with Russia.